Zariah Tillman had just touched down at LAX after a long 4.5-hour flight from Atlanta. Her mind was foggy from the stale air of the plane, her body drained from the cramped space, but she wasn't in a rush. As others hurried past her, Zariah moved with a calm, collected pace, her eyes scanning the familiar hustle of the airport. But something felt off, like she was being watched. She couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on her, trailing her every step. She wasn't a stranger to this feeling. Being a young black woman, she had often felt the weight of judgment in spaces she wasn't supposed to occupy. Yet, today, in her simple, effortless outfit, a cream-colored knit set and white sneakers, Zariah wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just herself. But airports, as always, had a way of turning ordinary moments into uncomfortable ones, especially if you didn't fit the expected mold. As she walked toward the baggage claim, Zariah's phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "I'll be in the pickup lane. Call when you're at the curb. Love you, Z." A smile tugged at her lips as she tucked the phone back into her bag. She wasn't just any passenger. She had a first-class ticket to match the kind of life she had earned. Yet, as she approached the checkpoint, she noticed a figure standing stiffly in the corner. Officer Brent Mallory, with his badge gleaming and his eyes locked on her. It was clear he was watching her. She felt it before she saw him. That glance, that sharp, discerning look. Was he waiting for something or someone? And why, of all people, was she his target? Zariah wasn't worried, but something inside her stirred. This wasn't just an ordinary interaction. It was the beginning of a story that would shake the very ground beneath her feet. Zariah felt it before she even heard the officer's voice. The heavy, suffocating pressure of being watched. She'd been in enough spaces where the gaze lingered a second too long. A silent judgment passed in the air. But today it was different. She could feel his eyes digging into her back, tracking her every move as she walked. Slowly, calmly, she made her way through the terminal, trying to ignore the knot that tightened in her stomach. She knew what was coming. It always did. "Excuse me, miss," came a voice, sharp and direct, slicing through the buzz of the airport. Zariah didn't flinch. She had heard that tone too many times before, the one that carried an unspoken command, as if her existence alone was enough to draw suspicion. She turned to face him, her heart a steady rhythm in her chest, trying to calm the rush of adrenaline that suddenly surged through her veins. "Yes?" she responded, her voice smooth, measured. "Can you step over here for me?" The officer's words were clipped, as if he had already made up his mind. There was no please, no room for negotiation, just an order. Zariah blinked, a flash of disbelief crossing her mind. For what? She'd already cleared security in Atlanta. She wasn't in a rush. She was just trying to get to baggage claim, like everyone else. "I already cleared security in Atlanta," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm just trying to get to baggage claim." The officer didn't move. He didn't smile. His eyes stayed fixed on her, and for a moment, Zariah thought she might crack under the weight of his gaze. But she didn't. She stood her ground, her body tensing, yet her posture unwavering. "I asked you to step over here," he repeated, his voice sharper now, tinged with annoyance, a thin veneer of control slipping. Zariah's mind raced as she looked around. The scene felt almost surreal. Passengers were moving past, oblivious to the quiet tension that was building around her. A young white guy in a Dodgers jersey walked by, earbuds in, duffel bag swinging, completely unaffected. A woman in business attire stepped briskly past without even glancing in her direction. But Zariah wasn't given that privilege. No, she was the one who had been singled out. She was the one who didn't belong. With a deep breath, she walked over to the officer, keeping her shoulders square. The air around her felt thick, the space narrowing with every step. She met his eyes, unfazed by the subtle shift in his posture, the subtle menace that seemed to gather in the space between them. "Is there something specific you need to see?" she asked, her voice steady, almost too calm. "Just answering some questions," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. His hand came out to take her boarding pass from her bag, inspecting it like a badge of suspicion. She handed it over, but he didn't let go right away. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as he examined it. He wasn't just looking for the ticket number or the flight details. No, there was something deeper in his scrutiny, something that made Zoraya's chest tighten. "First class," he said slowly, repeating the words as if they were foreign. He handed the ticket back, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. Zoraya didn't flinch, but she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Her body was telling her to move, to walk away, to get out of this maddening standoff, but she stood still. She would not let him see her shake. Not today. "Yeah, first class," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "What's the problem?" There was a long pause. His eyes met hers, and for a second, there was a flicker of something dangerous in his gaze. A shift, a slight twitch of his lips, a smirk that was not friendly, not amused. He didn't say anything for a moment, but she could feel the judgment hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. "You don't exactly look like our typical first-class passenger," he said finally, each word coming out slowly, deliberately, like he was savoring the discomfort he was causing. Zoraya's stomach churned. The words stung, but she didn't let him see it. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, the question hanging in the air. "And what does a typical first-class passenger look like to you?" Her words were measured, but there was an edge to them now, a quiet defiance that had started to simmer beneath her calm exterior. He didn't answer. He just stood there, his arms crossed in front of him, a smug little twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was like he was daring her to challenge him, to get angry, to give him a reason to escalate. But Zoraya wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. "Do you have a reason to detain me?" she asked. The question hung in the air, thick with tension. For a long moment, the officer didn't respond, and Zoraya's patience stretched, her body poised like a spring ready to snap. But still, she held her ground. She would not let him win. Not today. Not when she knew this was more than just a random screening. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, but the words carried weight. She wasn't asking for his permission. She was asserting her own rights. The officer's brow twitched, and Zoraya saw the shift. He wasn't used to being checked like this. He wasn't used to being questioned by someone who refused to shrink in the face of authority. She unlocked her phone and looked at him, a calm certainty in her eyes. "I'm calling my father." Mallory raised an eyebrow, a mix of confusion and amusement crossing his face. "Who are you calling? A lawyer? A congressman?" But Zoraya didn't answer. She pressed the call button, and as the phone rang twice, the officer's posture shifted again. And that was when the real game began. The phone rang twice. The seconds stretched like hours, and as the call connected, Zoraya's heart thudded in her chest. But her face remained calm, an unshakable mask. Officer Mallory stood there, watching her, his expression slowly shifting from smug amusement to something less certain. He could sense something was about to change. He just didn't know how much. "Z," came her father's voice on the other end, calm and steady. "You good?" The warmth of his voice wrapped around her like a shield, but she knew what was at stake. She wasn't just dealing with an unreasonable officer. No, this was about something far bigger. Something that everyone who had ever been judged for their skin color, their name, or their background would understand. This was about a society that thought it had the right to decide who belonged where, and Zoraya was tired of being defined by anyone but herself. She looked at Officer Mallory, locking eyes with him, her resolve like steel. "Daddy," she said softly, but there was a firmness in her tone, a quiet power that had been inherited from him. "There's an officer here who thinks I don't belong at this terminal. I need you to come." A silence hung in the air between them. Mallory's face twitched. He chuckled under his breath, thinking this was just another empty threat, a child calling for help. "Who are you calling now, miss?" he asked, his voice dripping with derision. But Zoraya didn't respond. She didn't have to. The officer was about to learn a hard lesson about who Zoraya Tillman was. "On my way," her father said without hesitation, and the conversation ended. Zoraya slipped the phone back into her pocket with the same deliberate movement. Not a word spoken. She felt the eyes of bystanders on her now, the silent anticipation hanging in the air. The officer didn't know it, but the power had already shifted. She had a father who wasn't afraid to step into that airport and make sure his daughter's dignity was defended. Zoraya stood still, her shoulders squared, her body radiating calm defiance. Mallory shifted uncomfortably. The smugness that had once clung to him now slipped away, replaced with an unease that began to grow as the seconds ticked by. It wasn't just about Zoraya anymore. It was about him. He could feel it, a gnawing awareness that something was coming, something he couldn't control. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, not with such quiet certainty. The minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Zoraya didn't flinch. She didn't break. She wasn't afraid. She'd been taught to be strong in situations like this, not to show weakness. But even so, her stomach burned with frustration. She had done everything right. Everything society told her she should do. She dressed neatly. She was calm. She answered every question. Yet none of it mattered. It never did. "Why are you doing this?" Zoraya asked, her voice suddenly quiet, yet powerful. Mallory looked at her with a mix of confusion and irritation. "Routine," he muttered, his voice tightening, his bravado barely holding together. "Just routine." But Zoraya wasn't buying it. "No one else from my flight is being stopped," she said, her voice unwavering. "So why me?" A flicker of realization crossed his face. He knew he couldn't answer that. He couldn't justify his actions. Zoraya's question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. This wasn't just a random check. She knew it, he knew it. He had targeted her, and now that fact was hanging in the balance. People were watching now. A mother nearby glanced over with wide eyes, then quickly averted her gaze, pretending not to notice. A baggage handler, moving slowly down the aisle, paused, his gaze lingering on Zoraya and the officer before quickly looking away. It was like the air had shifted, thick with the realization that something was wrong here. Mallory stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "You think you're better than everyone else?" The words were meant to sting, to poke at the vulnerability he assumed she had. He wasn't expecting Zoraya's response. Her voice was steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Better than everyone else?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You don't know anything about me." His eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, crowding her space just a little more. "People who act like they're better than everyone else usually have something to hide." The words hit harder than he probably intended, but Zoraya didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She didn't lose control. Instead, she just stood there, tall, unwavering, a calm force in the face of his aggression. Inside, her mind raced, her blood boiled with the unfairness of it all. This was not the first time she'd faced this. This wasn't the first time someone had looked at her, a black woman, and assumed she didn't belong. But it was the first time she wasn't backing down. It was the first time she wasn't afraid to call it out. "That's not my problem," she said, her words sharp and clear. Mallory stepped back, stunned by her response. He had expected her to get angry, to lash out. But Zoraya didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her calmness exuding power, and for the first time, he seemed unsure. Zoraya unlocked her phone, her thumb hovering just above the screen. Officer Mallory didn't know what was coming. He was about to learn that Zoraya Tillman was not just a random passenger. She was someone who would not be pushed around. "I'm calling my father," she repeated, her voice unwavering. Her father, Reginald Tillman, didn't need any explanation. He didn't need to ask why. He didn't need to understand the specifics of the situation. He just knew, and in that moment, Zoraya knew she wasn't alone. She wasn't just some random passenger. She was his daughter. And in that moment, Reginald Tillman was going to make sure everyone knew that no one, not even an officer, could trample on her dignity. And with that, the balance of power had shifted. The minutes stretched on, each one thicker than the last. Zoraya stood, unmoving, her eyes locked onto Officer Mallory's with a steady, unwavering gaze. Her stomach churned with frustration, But she didn't let him see it. She could feel the shift in the air around her. People were still walking by, but now they were watching, their movements slowing as they picked up on the tension, like a ripple spreading through the crowd. Mallory shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering between Zariah and the terminal entrance. The earlier smugness in his stance was starting to falter. His shoulders were a little tighter now, his posture less confident. Something was coming. He didn't know what, but he could feel it. Deep in his gut, Zariah's phone buzzed again, and her thumb hovered just above the screen, poised to make the call that would change everything. The officer couldn't have known who Zariah was, what family she came from, or how little control he had over this situation. But he was about to find out. And when Reginald Tillman, her father, walked into that terminal, everything would shift. Just then, the sliding glass doors at the entrance opened, and two sleek black SUVs pulled up in front of the terminal, the engines purring softly as they idled. Zariah glanced at them, but there was no sign of urgency in her movements. She didn't need to look back to know what was about to happen. The air around her had already begun to change, and Mallory felt it too, as though the ground beneath him was starting to shift, subtly at first, but gaining momentum. The door of the lead SUV opened, and a tall figure stepped out, his movements smooth, purposeful. Reginald Tillman was calm, composed, with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. His dark suit fit him perfectly, and the streaks of gray at his temples only added to his undeniable presence. He didn't rush, didn't look around the terminal for signs of drama. Instead, he walked toward the building with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of experience in spaces that didn't expect him, yet always left with a profound shift in the air once he was gone. Officer Mallory's gaze snapped toward him, his body tensing as he realized that this was no ordinary arrival. The man walking toward them had the air of someone who owned the room, and Mallory had no idea how much he was about to regret his actions. Zariah's eyes met her father's, and the slightest smile tugged at her lips. She hadn't said a word, but her heart surged with relief. This wasn't just a father coming to defend his daughter. This was the moment that would make it all clear. This was the moment Reginald Tillman would show the world that the fight for respect, for dignity, wasn't just about words. It was about presence. And his presence was enough. Reginald didn't look at Mallory, didn't acknowledge the officer at first. He simply kept walking, his pace steady, his eyes focused on his daughter. Zariah could feel the tension rising in the air as people around them began to shift, to take notice. They could sense that something was about to happen, and this time, it wasn't something they could ignore. When he reached Zariah, Reginald leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "You all right?" he asked in a low, steady voice, his presence wrapping around her like a protective cloak. "I'm fine," Zariah replied, her voice calm, though the emotions bubbling inside her were anything but. She was fine because her father was here. She was fine because, in this moment, nothing would break her resolve. Then, Reginald turned his attention to Officer Mallory. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to make a scene. He simply looked at Mallory, his gaze sharp, deliberate. "Are you the one who stopped my daughter?" Reginald's voice was measured, not loud, not angry, but there was weight in it. It was the kind of question that carried the weight of years of authority, of experience. It wasn't a question that demanded an answer. It was one that expected accountability. Mallory straightened, his breath catching in his throat. The confident arrogance he'd once carried so effortlessly now seemed fragile. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. I was following routine protocol," Mallory stammered, his voice trembling slightly. "Protocol?" Reginald's voice dropped a fraction, still calm, but with an edge that made Mallory's blood run cold. "You decided to stop my daughter based on what exactly? Her appearance? Her ticket class?" Reginald wasn't raising his voice, but the force of his words cut through the air, slicing through the noise of the terminal like a knife. Mallory could feel the walls closing in. The power he had once thought was his had slipped away, and now, the true authority in the room was standing right before him. Reginald didn't give Mallory a chance to respond. He turned to the airport supervisor, who had been standing in the background, quietly watching the scene unfold. Her name tag read T. Ramirez, and she had been observing, taking note of every word, every movement. "Ma'am," Reginald said, his voice still calm but now with the weight of finality. "I would like a full report on this incident, and I expect to speak with someone from your legal team by the end of the day. You have no idea what you've just done." The supervisor nodded, stepping forward. She didn't look at Mallory. She didn't need to. Her focus was entirely on Reginald, who was now, undeniably, the force that would change the course of this incident. Reginald's gaze returned to Mallory, and his words were sharp. "You saw a young woman standing in line with her documents in hand. You saw a first-class ticket, and your instinct was to humiliate her, to question her for no reason. You picked the wrong daughter on the wrong day." Mallory didn't speak. His jaw clenched as he swallowed, his face flushed with the realization that nothing he said could undo what had just been set in motion. The supervisor, now fully in control, turned toward Zariah, her expression softening. "Ma'am, I apologize for the way you were treated. If you'd like, I can escort you to file a formal report." Zariah glanced at her father, who gave her a nod. She wasn't ready for apologies. She was ready for change. Reginald stepped closer to Mallory, his voice low, but unmistakably powerful. "You'll never work this terminal again. Whether you keep your badge is up to your department, but here, you're done." Mallory's throat tightened as he stood in silence, the weight of Reginald's words sinking in. Reginald turned to Zariah, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He didn't need to say anything else. He had made his point, and in that moment, Zariah knew that her father had given her more than just protection. He had shown her what true power looked like, silent, steady, and unwavering. The tension in the air didn't dissipate immediately. Reginald Tillman's words still hung heavy over the scene, lingering like smoke after a fire. Mallory stood still, his face flushed, his body rigid, trying to digest the weight of what had just transpired. The confidence he had entered the terminal with had crumbled in front of everyone, replaced by a quiet, humiliating defeat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her father. Reginald turned to Zariah, his hand still on her shoulder, a quiet understanding between them. He didn't say anything else, but his presence spoke volumes. It wasn't just about the officer or the incident. It was about power, respect, and the unspoken rules that had governed Zariah's life in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. Her father had shown her that sometimes silence was the loudest weapon of all. Zariah looked around, feeling the eyes of those around her. The passengers who had been watching from the sidelines were no longer just passive observers. They were witnesses to something that was about to send ripples through the very structure of the airport. Ripples that might, just might, cause change. But that change wouldn't come easily, not without consequences. The airport staff began to move with a sense of urgency, not necessarily out of respect, but because they knew what had just happened. There was a shift in the room, a palpable change in the energy. People were no longer walking by with the indifference they had once shown. There was a new awareness in their eyes. They had seen the power of authority exercised, but they had also witnessed the power of restraint, of measured words, and the courage to stand up against what was wrong. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for what you've gone through," the supervisor, Ramirez, said, her voice professional, yet sincere. "We'll start an internal review of the situation, and I'll make sure you're informed of the outcome. If you wish to file a formal report, I'll escort you to the office now." Zariah nodded, but she wasn't interested in the apology. She had heard apologies her entire life, from the same people who never seemed to change. She wasn't looking for another one. What she wanted, what she needed, was accountability, and she knew her father wouldn't stop until there was a resolution. "I'll think about it," Zariah said, her voice low but firm. Reginald placed a hand on her back and gently guided her toward the exit. He didn't speak at first, but Zariah could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the pride in his eyes that she wasn't sure she had earned but was beginning to understand as they walked toward the sliding glass doors. The hum of the airport around them seemed distant, muted by the intensity of what had just happened. The quiet confidence of her father was a force she could feel pushing against the noise, against the world that so often sought to silence her. It was a kind of power she hadn't understood until now. The power to simply be, unapologetically, and to demand respect without ever raising her voice. But even in the calm, there was a lingering unease that Zoraya couldn't shake. She hadn't expected this to go the way it did. Her father's arrival had turned the tide, but what would happen next? The airport staff, the officers, were they going to let this slide? What about the other passengers who had watched this unfold? Would they forget? Would they care? A few feet ahead, the two black SUVs that had brought them here were parked in the curbside pickup lane. The driver opened the door, and Zoraya climbed in, still processing everything that had just occurred. Reginald followed, his eyes never leaving her, as if trying to understand the turmoil that still churned inside her. The storm that hadn't yet cleared. He sat down beside her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet in the car was soothing, a rare moment of peace after the storm. But it wasn't over. Zoraya could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the heaviness of what had happened and what was yet to come. "Dad," Zoraya said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "What happens now?" Reginald leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest as he thought about his answer. "Now, we make sure this doesn't happen again," he said slowly. "We make sure people know that what happened to you, can't go unnoticed. People need to understand that accountability doesn't just happen when it's convenient. It happens when it's uncomfortable, when it's hard." Zoraya nodded, absorbing his words. She had always known her father as a man of action, a man who didn't sit back and wait for change to come. He made it happen. But this was different. This wasn't about business deals or making a name for himself. This was about standing up for the very thing that had been stripped from her again and again. The right to walk through a space without fear, without judgment. "I don't want to be a symbol," Zoraya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be," Reginald replied, his tone softening. "But sometimes the world forces you to be. And when it does, you show them what you're made of. You stand tall, you speak the truth, and you make sure they listen." Zoraya swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always believed in the power of silence, the power of not reacting, of not giving in to the noise around her. But now, she realized something. The silence was powerful, but only when it was filled with purpose. And today, she had filled it with purpose. The car started moving, the city skyline slowly coming into view as they drove away from the airport. Zoraya looked out the window, the world passing by in a blur. But as she watched the city slip further and further into the distance, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And whatever came next, she would face it head-on, with the strength of her father's lessons behind her and the courage she had found within herself. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. By the time Zoraya stepped into her father's car, the ripple effects of what had just occurred began to spread like wildfire, igniting a storm across the terminal, through social media, and into the hearts and minds of countless others who had felt the sting of prejudice and discrimination. What had started as a quiet confrontation between Zoraya and Officer Mallory was now a pivotal moment, one that would leave a mark far beyond the walls of the airport. As the car pulled away from the curb, Zoraya couldn't help but glance back at the terminal in her rearview mirror. The scene still played out in her mind, the tension, the questions, the judgment. She had stood her ground, unwavering in the face of authority. But now the question was, what would happen next? Would this be another forgotten moment, a mere blip on the radar of systemic injustice? Or would this spark something greater, something that could not be ignored? The moment her father's black SUVs rolled through the terminal's entrance, the world began to take notice. Someone had filmed the incident, capturing the silent power that Zoraya and her father exuded. And it wasn't long before the footage began to make its way across social media. What had begun as a small exchange between an officer and a passenger suddenly transformed into a story that the world couldn't ignore. The footage was raw, unfiltered, a snapshot of reality that felt both familiar and jarring. There was Zoraya, standing tall, her eyes unflinching as she faced down the officer. And there was Reginald Tillman, walking through the doors like he owned the place, a man of stature and quiet authority. The two of them, father and daughter, radiated a calm power that was undeniable. Their silent unity, their calm defiance, spoke volumes more than any shouting match could have. Within hours, the video went viral. It was shared, retweeted, and posted across every platform imaginable. The hashtag respect not privilege began trending, a wave of support pouring in from every corner of the internet. It was as though a dam had broken, and people who had once remained silent in the face of injustice were now speaking out, sharing their own stories of discrimination, of being unfairly judged, of feeling small in spaces they should have occupied freely. Zoraya's phone buzzed incessantly, each message a mix of congratulations, support, and shared pain. Strangers from all over the country reached out, their voices trembling with emotion, telling her their own stories of being discriminated against, of having to fight for their dignity in ways that were exhausting, frustrating, and all too familiar. They saw themselves in Zoraya, and they saw in her the strength to stand up, to rise above, to refuse to be diminished. She wasn't just a victim in their eyes. She was a symbol of resilience, of quiet revolution. But not everyone saw it that way. Almost immediately, the backlash started. The hate-filled messages poured in just as swiftly as the supportive ones. They accused her of using her father's influence to get special treatment, of playing the rich girl card, of making a mountain out of a molehill. They saw her confidence, her poise, and they interpreted it as arrogance, as entitlement. Some argued that she was being too sensitive or overreacting. In their eyes, she had overstepped, because how dare a young black woman question the authority of an officer without fear of consequence? It was clear that the story was bigger than just Zoraya. It had become a battleground. On one side were those who saw her as a hero, a symbol of justice. On the other side were those who wanted to see her brought down, to see the myth of equal opportunity shattered in the face of her defiance. Reginald, ever the pragmatist, had known that the aftermath wouldn't be easy. But he also knew that change rarely came without sacrifice, without the pushback of those who wanted to maintain the status quo. He was prepared for the fight that was about to come, both the public one and the one that would happen behind closed doors. And Zoraya? She wasn't sure what she had gotten herself into, but she wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about the officer. It wasn't even just about her. It was about everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. As the hours turned into days, the debate raged on. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing experts on both sides of the issue, discussing race, privilege, and the disparities in how people were treated based on their appearance. But the one question that everyone seemed to ask, whether in support or opposition, was this: why did it take this moment for something to finally change? By the end of the week, the situation at LAX was no longer just a local story. It had gone global. Articles were written about Zoraya's dignity, about the silent strength she had shown in standing up to an officer who had no right to stop her. There were features on news programs, podcasts, and online platforms. She was even invited to speak at a rally, not as a symbol of a movement, but as someone who had lived the movement, someone who understood what it meant to walk through the world with the weight of discrimination hanging on your every step. Zoraya had been thrust into the spotlight, something she never asked for, never desired, but something she was beginning to understand was necessary. She wasn't going to let it define her, but she wasn't going to hide from it either. The moment had come and she had seized it. She had opened the door, and now she could see the world beyond it. And the world had started to take notice. Reginald, watching his daughter from the sidelines, felt a swell of pride, but also a quiet sadness. He had always hoped for a world where his daughter could walk without fear, where she could travel without being questioned, where her worth wasn't measured by the color of her skin. But he also knew that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. And Zoraya? She stood tall, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that, with or without the spotlight, she had already won. She had claimed her dignity, and in doing so, she had shown others that they, too, could do the same. The world would change, not because of grand speeches or violent protests, but because of quiet acts of defiance. Acts like hers that spoke louder than words ever could. In the end, Zoraya's story became more than just an incident at an airport. It became a call to action, a moment that sparked conversations around the world about the importance of dignity, respect, and standing up for what's right. What began as a quiet encounter with an officer, filled with judgment and discrimination, transformed into a powerful lesson in resilience and self-worth. For Zoraya, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating the officer or seeking some kind of public validation. It was about reclaiming her power, her identity, and her right to exist without fear of being judged or marginalized based on her appearance. She stood tall, not because of the circumstances she faced, but because she had learned from an early age the power of patience, self-control, and the importance of speaking up when it mattered most. Her father, Reginald Tillman, was her pillar throughout this experience. His quiet strength, his belief in doing what was right, gave Zoraya the courage to face the officer with composure and to turn what could have been a negative encounter into something much larger, a moment of clarity that resonated deeply with others. But this story isn't just Zoraya's, it's everyone's. It's a reminder that we all have the power to stand up against injustice, to say no when we are treated unfairly, and to demand respect in every space we occupy. The lessons that come from Zoraya's experience can teach us all how to handle adversity with grace, how to challenge bias with dignity, and how to ensure that our voices, no matter how quiet, are heard. It teaches us that the power to change the world often lies not in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday moments where we choose to make our stand. Zoraya's actions also highlight a key lesson. Silent defiance is not weakness, it is strength. In a world that often rewards loudness and aggression, there is something profoundly powerful about standing firm in your truth without raising your voice. It takes immense strength to stay calm in the face of prejudice, to not let the actions of others dictate your emotional state, and to remain resolute even when the odds are against you. Zoraya's ability to do this was her greatest weapon, and it's something we can all learn from. Moreover, the support Zoraya received from her father is a testament to the importance of having allies, especially those who see you for who you truly are, not through the lens of society's preconceived notions. Reginald didn't need to rush in with anger or violence. He showed up, not with accusations, but with unwavering support and quiet confidence. That's the kind of allyship that creates real change. Not the kind that speaks over others, but the kind that stands alongside them. The ripple effect of this moment was felt by countless people around the world. Social media lit up with stories of people who had faced similar moments of discrimination, people who had been made to feel small for no other reason than their appearance. But Zoraya's strength gave them hope. It reminded them that their voices matter, that their worth is not determined by anyone else's bias or judgment. Now, as we reflect on this story, we are reminded of the value of human dignity. The simple truth is this: we all deserve respect. No one should ever feel less than because of who they are. And when we do encounter injustice, it's essential to remember that it's not about backing down. It's about staying true to ourselves, holding our heads high, and challenging the status quo, no matter how uncomfortable it may make others so. What's the takeaway from Zoraya's story? It's simple. Never let anyone make you feel small. Stand up for yourself. Stand up for others. Speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. And most importantly, remember that your dignity is yours to claim, no matter who tries to take it from you. If Zoraya's story has moved you, if it has reminded you of the power we each hold in our own lives, then don't let it stop here. Let this moment inspire you to take action, to make the world a little bit better, and to support those around you in their own struggles. And if you want to see more stories like Zoraya's, more stories of strength, resilience, and quiet revolution, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Stay informed, stay inspired, and together, let's continue to make a difference, one story at a time. Thank you for reading, for watching, and for being a part of this journey. Keep standing tall, keep speaking out, and keep shining your light. The world is waiting for it.